Hello, everyone. And thank you, Graham, for that talk. I think I'm going to lean heavily on that because that gives you a very operator-heavy perspective. And we advise investors and operators in trying to see how you can, what's next in this industry and how to navigate it. So we're actually going to spend a little time trying to also analyze where UK is compared to the rest of the markets. And as PMP strategy, we've got offices across Europe, across North America, in Middle East, and in Africa as well. So we've got quite a bit of perspective on how different countries behave and how the consumers in different countries behave. So just going on to that first, if we look back at why there was significant investment in this particular market, and we move a decade back to early 2010s, when the first companies like Hyperoptic and City Fiber were born, you had very strong demand drivers and supply drivers. So on the demand driver side, there was so many charts that showed that consumer and businesses are just going to keep consuming significant amount of data going forward in ridiculous CAGR numbers, sometimes going into 3 digits. And that has been the case up between 2010 and 2023. So that was the underlying trend for why people invested in broadband infrastructure. And there was just fiber as compared to all the other technologies that could be updated in a way that it could meet this future demand. So there was the growth factor for this data consumption was because of impeding video consumption trends, whether it was through social media, through your smart home devices, Netflix taking over your traditional cable TV, and then increasing applications of B2B and B2C applications. So you're again, from a business perspective, a lot more reliance on cloud infrastructure. From a home perspective, everyone had Alexa, smart TVs. All of this was mushrooming and getting into every home. Recently, we've seen a lot more of hybrid working, which of course requires reliable broadband infrastructure. But looking ahead, this demand is only going to sort of amplify, and investors saw that as a great opportunity to sort of get into this UK market and ensure they've put their capital in to leverage this growth. On the supply drivers, if you look back at 2010, BT and Virgin Media were not very keen on deploying new infrastructure when they'd already put cable and FTTC network in the ground. So they're trying to sweat that asset, ensure that they're not duplicating their networks. And they also didn't think that there's going to be anyone that's going to come in and challenge them, having such strong retail and infrastructure position. At that time, macroeconomic conditions were very strong. The cost of capital was extremely low. A lot of investment funds in the Middle East or in UK had sort of allocated a certain amount of capital that's going to go into fiber investment, and they were deploying it really heavily, very fast, looking for good companies that they could back so that they can build this network infrastructure. And as Graham mentioned, the regulatory environment was also very, very strong with government indicating that they're going to support this kind of investment and giving strong support to the community to engage in further drawdown of funds. Things changed a little bit after 2018, which is when you saw a very crowded altnet market. You had a potential idea of copper switch off, which again gave a lot of boost to this market. And then in 2020, what we had is that there was slowdown because of lockdown. Altnet's rollout ambitions were not met. Take-up was underwhelming. I think it's also important to go back to the test eras that happened between 2015, 2016, where they started deploying fiber in small parts of the community to test their investment case. And initially, the fiber take-up was about 50%, 40 to 50% in these small communities in a very short period of time. And of course, investors were very happy to look at that. If you step back and look at your spreadsheet and see how this is going to go on 10 to 15 years, 40% take-up is very strong. The challenger brand coming in saying BT and Virgin Media are not going to be able to meet your sort of broadband demands, and we will, and standing out as a brand that sort of really, really helps your investment case. But now if we come to 2020, 2022, those take-up figures went down significantly. Everyone else has started building. The trust was not quite there. Consumers are very confused about the kind of products that they were being offered, whether it was full fiber, part fiber, ultra fast, not super fast, what have you. And also, I guess, having these poles being put up, your street being dug, not quite the positive experience that consumers really wanted. And also important to maybe we'll come to this a little bit later. But things look very, very different now. All the demand and supply drivers have basically reversed. Incumbents, so that is Virgin Media and BT, have now really taken control of the market. They're very aggressive in deploying fiber, acquiring fiber companies, ensuring that they can, BT has gone to now having 9 million homes connected, where you had the likes of City Fiber with just 2 million in the last 10 years. So, oops, did I? Okay, so this slide is actually quite interesting in that it tells you why UK behaves differently to the other economies. So Spain, France, Portugal, they all have had very, very successful customer penetration, so very strong take-up. In fact, Spain, the more accurate number is now about 82%. And if you look at the chart on the right, this basically shows that every other country, before fiber came to market, had two predominant technologies. They had copper, DSL, and they had cable. UK and Germany were the only European countries that actually had FTTC in between that was able to meet the current needs of UK customers. So the value proposition for fiber was not as strong as it was in the other market. The difference in customer experience with your faster broadband technology, symmetry of speeds, was not quite felt yet in the market. It will in the future. But that has had a huge impact in the take-up numbers that you're experiencing today. So what about the market now? What does that look like? I think it's also important to first step back and see the different kind of players and actors in the market. So you've got fiber operators, you've got investors, that could be debt, equity investors, you have the consumer, and you have the regulator. So if you look at the challenges that the fiber operator faces, they are operating under extremely harsh conditions, as sort of mentioned earlier. There's aggressive competitive landscape. There's challenges with raising funds, refinancing debt. Debt has gotten significantly more expensive. Expanding your network is becoming a lot more challenging. They're missing business plan targets, whether this could be from the perspective of hitting those CPPP, which is the cost to pass a premise, cost to connect a premise, the number of premises passed, whether it's the take-up that you expected. These are all targets that are being very, very difficult to meet for majority of the operators that have specifically got funding. And there's also challenges with scaling up. When you're a startup, you've got 10, 20 employees, and you're building the network. You know how to do the small area. But suddenly your investors expect you to go to 5 different areas, 6 different areas, have 10 different zones in one area active at the same time. That gets really challenging to do. And a lot of work that we're doing right now is working with altnets to figure out how are they going to scale up, how are they going to have the right systems in place, have the right partners in place to be able to meet the targets that they've got in their business plans. On the other hand, you've got investors that invested in these companies with an assumption of the market, with an assumption of what the competitive landscape was going to look like, an assumption of what the cost is going to look like, and what the customer take-up is going to look like. All of that looks really different now. So they are in the process of understanding whether they want to put in more capital into these companies, good money after bad, or do they want to limit their risk and their exposure to the industry? At the same time, they're very keen on trying to help their portfolio companies in aligning their performances so that these companies can then be sold on to someone else and they can make that return that they expected on their investments. They are also trying to anticipate what's happening in the market, how they're going to respond to these shifts in the market. From a customer perspective, it's inflation, rising cost of living, looking at the competitive offers, having these roads dig up. That's their current experience. Now, regulator is quite important in this industry. They are in charge of balancing the interest of consumers and businesses and investors. They are in charge of ensuring fair competition exists between incumbent and new entrants. They are in charge of promoting fiber as a technology. And they're very much in charge of giving confidence to investor community for their continued investments. So if we look at each of these operators, just to contextualize how they're behaving in the market, Openreach, Virgin Media, as I said before, they started off with not quite keen a decade ago in trying to get into the fiber game yet, but their current strategy is very much offensive deployment of fiber. They want to cover as much area as quickly as possible. They want to get these smaller players out that have created that noise in the market, that have had a significant dent to their retail position. And if we look at the kind of altnets that exist, They're not all the same. You've got some really large altnets, you've got some medium and small size altnets, and then you've got some community interest companies. The large altnets are typically the ones that deploy in really urban or very dense areas where you've got lower capex per premise, you've got very high likelihood of take-up. GigaClear focuses on rural, but rich rural areas. Then you've got smaller companies that have strong cherry-picking strategy. They focus on niche markets. Sometimes they focus just on businesses. Sometimes they focus on student accommodation. And you just have a variety of niche markets that they're trying to hit. We also did this exercise where we tried to model whether this kind of investment in so many homes, as Graham said, they intend to cover UK 3 times and over, whether that's something that is financially viable. And this model actually looks slightly different now with inflation eroding the future profits. But what we saw was in very, very urban areas, very dense areas like pockets of London, there could be 3 or 4 networks, and this includes Openreach and Virgin Media. But now with the revised, the costing put into place in the model, that looks slightly different. It looks like 2.5 networks might survive in one area. And it's also very important to consider the retail level competition, because you are not servicing just as an infrastructure operator. You have TalkTalk, Sky, BT, Virgin Media with very, very strong brands that currently rely on different infrastructures, and you're coming in as an altnet, as a completely different sort of player, trying to fight with these guys for a market share. And this, I think, was quite interesting to show, because this kind of tells you what the ambition of altnets was versus what they actually achieved. So of the about 60-odd players that we sort of filtered through to get a larger scale, we realized 2/3 of them want to go above 500K homes passed, while in actuality, there are 14 odd altnets that have gone over 100K. And you can see some of them on the right. You can see City Fiber, Hyperoptic, Community, G-Network. Now, Hyperoptic, Community, G-Network, all London-focused, much easier to sort of cross to quickly surpass SOMI premises. Netomnia, Fibrous have done really, really well in their rural communities. But between what people aimed to sort of do within 2022, 2023, they're quite far behind. So that really gets us to what are the factors that will lead to consolidation. Why are we thinking about consolidation at this stage? So we're looking at 3 different problems. The ability to access further capital at very promising conditions, their ability to sort of ensure that they can get take-up, so on a revenue side can maintain certain revenues, and also ensure that the costs are foreseeably, they can withstand that margin pressure. And if you can't do that, which a lot of altnets can't do right now, then they run into financial difficulties, or they start to look like very attractive targets for now the incumbents to come in and try to sweep in and get that foothold on the ground. So let's look at the strategic acquisition targets and why would someone want to acquire an altnet, right? So they could be trying to expand geographically, they could be trying to increase their market share, they could be trying to eliminate competitive threat. They could also be trying to leverage economies of scale and have cost efficiencies. But not all altnets are built the same. Not all of them are going to look very attractive. So the 2 factors that typically stand out for an altnet is their scale. So how many homes have they covered? For someone like Virgin Media, that would be key, because they're trying to hit those numbers of fiber homes passed. And acquiring a company that has already done the work, laid down fiber in the ground, that's really, really helpful to quickly get those numbers hit. And then on the other hand, you have take-up. So that's the number of customers that you've got, and the customers now add value to your network, because what's the point of laying that network down if there's no one that's willing to use it? So in these 4 quadrants, you can see the ones that are least attractive are the ones that have no scale and have limited take-up. Then the ones that are kind of attractive are the ones that have scale. So that would be, again, of interest to companies like Virgin Media, City Fiber, that are trying to expand really quickly and get that competitive edge. For sort of businesses that have take-up but low scale. So they have customers but low scale. So maybe regional companies that could be attracted to ISPs that are looking to grow their market share. But the most attractive companies are those that have scale and have take-up. So that's the like of Hyperoptic, City Fiber, where they have adequate sort of room in the ground and also have customers. Now, acquisition is also dependent on certain other value propositions. It could be a key contract that you have as a customer. It could be a wholesale agreement that you have with the likes of TalkTalk, Sky is interested. That could be really valuable for a company to acquire. It could be key relationship with suppliers and builders. It could be know-how and rollout tools. What we've learned is that not every organization knows how to roll out fiber really quickly and scale really effectively. So if you do know how to do that, you become very, very valuable. And what we believe is that consolidation will happen in waves. It will first happen to companies that are experiencing financial difficulties, and those that are really attractive. Then it'll happen to mid-sized businesses where investors are looking to exit. Then another wave of investments and consolidation may happen after the public funding and voucher programs have been sort of completed. And then finally, once macroeconomic and industry dynamics have stabilized, then larger acquisitions will occur to eliminate competition, drive business growth, and challenge established players. And this is where you could possibly see that third infrastructure operator coming and standing in the market. Now, this is the most text-heavy slide that I've got. Apologies for that. But this basically shows you the kind of factors that will play out, how consolidation sort of effectively moves the landscape is dependent on largely these factors. So if you look at the operator or the company-specific factor, then looking at them as an acquisition target, it's really important to see how they will integrate into your company. We were discussing this a short while back, but integration challenges are huge. They're costly and they take a long, long time. So is it worth putting in that much amount of time and money to integrate your systems for the value that you're paying for that asset? Do you have the right scale, reach, and customer penetration to justify these costs and integration barriers? Then you have network quality. Now, we do this all the time. We come in and assess different network qualities, and we realize that then there's such a wide difference between the network, the quality of network that one altnet has built to the other. And the number of homes passed are often not very closely linked to the numbers of homes that can be connected. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into making sure that that network is viable and will require no further cost to make it operational. And then from an investor perspective, the idea of continuously investing into their businesses while also limiting their exposure to this particular industry in the lights of the macroeconomic conditions and just generally market landscape is something that they're sort of keen on doing and understanding how to do better. And getting that return on the capital invested. And I think this goes back to how attractive the market was before when they were investing. The exit multiples, so the amount that they would have to, that they would exit at was just going up and up as more and more investors got in the market and these assets became really valuable. As a consequence, the business case has come under significant pressure. There's challenge to further compound this pressure by higher interest rates, risk of rising cost of capital, which is making it very, very difficult for the investors to imagine a scenario in which they're all going to get their sort of returns. There's probably going to be a lot of wiping off paper profits, and who's going to do that first is probably going to be the triggering factor for how consolidation plays out. And of course, regulators play a very, very strong role in how the industry shapes itself with sort of pricing strategy and consolidation of major players like Virgin Media and City Fiber, all falling within the purview of Ofcom. It's really important to see how they react so that they can have an influence on the whole community. This just shows on a wide landscape the different kinds of investors and the kind of portfolio companies they've got. They've started aggregating that. So one form of consolidation is starting to leverage this platform approach that Fern has taken, that Graham mentioned. Others could do pretty much the same thing. But the idea is to sort of make it easier, have similar systems in place, have similar tech stack in place so that it's easier for you to sell off to another bigger player and have much better integration. I think it was interesting to also see the parallel between what happened in the 90s with the cable companies and what's happening now with the fiber companies. Very similar to the fiber companies now. In 1992, there were about 29 companies. Lots came from US and Canada. This mushroomed to about 155 local companies between 1996 to 2003. And then finally, these were consolidated in two operations, NTL and Televest, which were then consolidated further to form Virgin Media. Virgin Media and all of these cable companies, of course, wanted to rival Sky. And finally, in the TV area, pay TV area, they had about 26% market share, where Sky with their satellite had 60% market share. But they did have strong hold of the telecommunication market and internet and broadband market. And it's also important to note that these companies sort of had distinct geographical presence, which made consolidation a lot more easier. Today with overbuild, that's not quite the case. But that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I think we can address some questions.
I'm Adam from Technetics. Let me contextualize my question. I think everyone in the room has been involved in cable for a while. And what we're doing at Technetics now is we're rolling out a remote OLT specifically designed for rural, ultra-rural applications, very low power. It's pretty interesting times. We're enjoying it. But what I notice a lack of in what I'm doing and generally across the industry is what cable was really good at was standards-based activity across different kinds of technology providers. And DOCSIS was a big success. I'm guessing you experienced it as well. And now what you see on the PON side of it is the standardization is really lacking on the technical side. And why is that? And actually, it's kind of a question to SCTE, like, maybe there's a role to be played on standards. And why is the industry so disjointed and interop such a major problem? Actually, it's on both sides because it matters on the investment side as well, because there's vendor lock on a lot of the OLT solutions, and it's a major problem when you're kind of looking at trying to combine two entities. What are you going to do with all the hardware? How do you actually create multi-vendor environment? That's what I'd like to hear your thoughts, having been in it. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry to interrupt. Richard Rees, TechWave, design and planning at the moment. Been in the industry for about 30 years. So I remember the cable rollout, HFC and standardization. I just built the white fiber network on the Isle of Wight. Started 5 years ago. And we happened to build that point to point. Hey, very different. There's no way that's going to get integrated into somebody else's network. So I was doing a business development role for them, and I was looking at how do we, as a funded by Infocapital, who now GigaClear, Oggy, etc. How would this all actually tie up? How would it all bolt together when even the cabinets have different keys, let alone the type of network that's going in the ground, whether it's direct bury or ducted or whatever. I mean, there's just so much out there. The way I found it to be was it was down to the initial consultants, because there was not a lot of knowledge in this business. There's not a lot of knowledge to begin with. So 3 or 4 key consultants all came along, and they all had their way of doing it, and it just seems to have pervaded out of a very early lack of knowledge that if a consultant said we're going to do it this way, that was how that network got built. And if that consultant had to pick up a different job down the road, that was how that network got built. And I think there was a very, very lack of knowledge in the front end of this that caused a lot of that, and we're going to pay the price. Just my experience.
Yeah, I get it. Although my question was kind of more on the technology layer. But you're right. Yeah.
Shall I go first? Okay. Is this working? Yeah, it is. Okay, so I mean, it's a good question. I'm kind of, since I stepped out of box, I've been doing some advisory work for some companies that want to get onto the procurement framework for what are the Type A and Type B lots now. And one of the things that you have to do if you get onto these procurement frameworks, which is different to the gigabit vouchers, because you just get a voucher and that's it. You don't have to wholesale your network, because actually that was really difficult to build and you need to try and drive some take up on that, is that you have to wholesale and you have to provide a solution for wholesaling. And I think most of the companies, including the big players, are trying to get on those procurement frameworks, because if you don't bid for an area and someone else gets in it and it was an area you wanted to build, then they're going to build it and get subsidy and actually, price undercut and things like that. So it's going to be an even bigger problem going forward, because if you do take a network, let's just say an operator with a couple of 100,000 homes, wins a subsidy to build an area that's 50,000 homes, and they've got to open those interfaces for Sky, TalkTalk, and that's great. So they can provide what they think is a great open wholesale platform to place orders, trouble tickets, manage faults, put in an ONT, and the ISP that's wholesaling can then go and put in their router, and you've got all these business processes that theoretically work. But then someone different wins the adjacent territory, and they've got a different platform and different systems and different interfaces. So I look at it and I think, look, there aren't that many providers at a network level. So there's Calix, there's Nokia, and there's Adtran that are providing the kit, and there's GPON and there's XGS-PON. So there's two flavors of that, and that's a bit like DOCSIS, where there's several versions of that now. The problem, and it may sound a little bit trite, I don't think is going to be at a network level, because you can provision a gig service by zapping, the OSS of the whether it's the Nokia or the Calix or the Adtran kit, and someone can get an end customer can get a gig through, and they can then go and plug in their router and take that over. But the business side of supporting that, just like all these companies have spent many tens of millions to get onto the BT eco platform, as it was, to be able to place orders, manage faults and things like that, it's not going to work while there's so many providers. It's just not possible. And it's going to be the biggest stumbling block unless a company, and there's 2 or 3 now that are saying that we've got the wholesale platform that everyone should be on. You should bolt into this, and it'll allow some openness of APIs to place orders, manage faults, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's all these 150 companies are not going to suddenly all choose the same BSS OSS layer. That ship sailed. Most of them have got their own in-house solutions. What you need now, if you want this wholesale platform to work, is a layer that sits in the middle of that everyone integrates to. And I think that's the direction this may be going. Otherwise, no one's going to be able to place any orders, because you're going to, each company, Sky, in a big company, everything has massive capital gates and nothing happens unless it's a 7-figure sum. And a big 7-figure sum to try and change to another provider. If you've got to do that 10, 15 times, you're just not going to bother. So everyone will stick with the OpenReach network until it's addressed. Sorry, it was a long answer, but I think it's at the BSS OSS layer that needs to happen first and soon.
Yeah, I believe there's a Swedish company that might be building that wholesale platform that the alternets can integrate into. So that is a problem that is recognized in the industry, and they're trying to find solutions that has worked in different markets and bringing it here.
It was never supposed to be this complicated. Yeah.
I think also worth mentioning that on the retail side, there are challenges to this as well, because then they have to develop their own systems, and it's not worth doing it for so many different players if you don't have the scale. So you need this on both infrastructure as well as retail level.
Hi, Shivani. Really interesting. I'm Neil from Virgin Media O2, so we've got some interest in all this, as you can imagine. You mentioned the bandwagon effect sort of drove the early years, and you mentioned that exit multiples and the business cases are coming under a bit of pressure for the altnets. And then you said it would come in waves. You think that's your prediction?
Yeah.
But you might get all the waves all at once, right? Because the first wave will demonstrate the exit multiples of the ones that get consolidated first. Might that then have a ripple effect through all the other ones saying, hey, these multiples are not exciting? Yeah. Will you get a reverse bandwagon effect?
Yeah, that could be. Definitely that's a possibility. I think because altnets have had such different strategies, for the larger ones, I think that's going to be the case. And those that have a wider geographic presence, it could be the case. But there are some that are very rural-based and are reliant on subsidies that might not follow the same trajectory at the same time. They could still you have some experience with rural, so some companies have done very successfully in these niche markets that might not need to fold at this moment and could wait out. Their investors are willing to sort of stand. It could be because they have funding from Middle East or don't have that harsh conditions to sort of get
more patient investors.
Much more patient investors, yeah. So they could withstand the pressure of not folding at this moment.
So it depends on the patience of the investors.
Yeah, definitely, and the risk appetite.
Graham, any thoughts from your experience of investors? How patient are they?
Yeah, so I think that's totally right. I think each investor's looking at this and seeing how overcommitted they are in the market, because obviously investors have a portfolio of companies and a portfolio of sectors that they put money into. And Shivani made the point about putting more money after something that may not have gone quite as well as you thought it was going to when it was, when there was uncertainty, or there was not the expectation that the market was going to become quite as congested as it is. So when PE firms are looking at companies now, the key things that they really look at, because not everyone, but there's overinflation about what you may have achieved. We've built 200,000 homes, but actually only 80,000 of them are ready for service. You can only install customers on 80,000 of those homes. The rest of them are possibly nearly built and work's gone into them, but it's not completely built. So the idea is that there's going to be a lot of diligence on those companies that are being acquired, right down to, it's got to be at a network level to really believe that those number of homes have actually been handed over to sales to be able to install customers, because the monetization is absolutely key. So I think the numbers are going to come down. I think the value of a property passed is used to be the big metric, and you'd get several £1,000s for each property that you've built a network past, because it was a land grab. Now you're looking at this, and you're looking at more as you would do a maturer business with a discounted cash flow. You can't do that with a startup. Obviously, there's got to be some elasticity there, but it's going to be far more forensic with the analysis. And truly, I don't know that truly talk about having quite a few 100,000 homes built, but an offer went in for 100 million. That's well below where you'd expect the market value to be. But actually, when someone's potentially a little bit stranded, and I don't want to talk, I'm just saying where companies now need that next round of funding for that next round of scale up, I'm sure there's going to be some low offers put in.
Does it feel like as an industry we have a problem with the definition of a homes passed then?
Not at all. I think there's a very clear definition of a home passed, and a very clear definition of a home passed has to be one that you can connect the customer to, and not when you send out an engineer and they find out that actually that customer's not live because the network wasn't properly tested. So, and every company is going through multiple stages of build. So every month you're saying, right, I've built these following X thousand homes, and they're now completed and tested, and you can install on them. And these next X thousand are part built. They've had the test rod and roping done and the fibres in, but they haven't been spliced. And then this next lot, we've test rod and roped this new area, and it shouldn't be long before we put the fibre in. And so there's that chain that's all part of the value of the company. And that all costs, but from a monetisation perspective, it's only the ones that are ready for service. And it needs to be broken down properly like that. And then the investors can look at the bits that aren't ready for service and put a value on that bit based on, if you've got 100,000 homes that are part built, that's great as well. That's great value. You've ring-fenced that area you're in there. You've started to perhaps reserve some of the infrastructure space, maybe on the PIA side, and it's good. So but a key metric now, and it's something that I've been through with our investors, is ready for service is the only number they care about, because it's the only one that's going to drive any revenue into the business. If we were up for sale, you would push everything you could do out there and say that, we've done that, but we've also got all these other parts in where we've got an IT system and it's ready to wholesale and blah, blah, blah.
Thank you. If as I'm getting the message that the altnets are not achieving the targets they'd like to, do you think this means that the investors are going to take a more hands-on approach? And if they do that, is that going to be a good thing or a bad thing?
In our experience, that's very much happened. We are now sitting in a lot of board meetings. We are also working very closely with a lot of managements in trying to figure out why those targets were not hit. And investors are embedding themselves in the boards of these companies and the management of these companies to see why they're not able to meet the targets that they were so confident they were going to. And investors have their own investment case, which is very different from the business case that management sort of portrays. So if you're not hitting those numbers that are discounted significantly based on what people like us have told the investors before, that becomes even more challenging. Some of the flaws lie, of course, in the market condition, and no one expected the interest rates to go up to this extent and inflation to be so prolonged. So that's hitting those. That's something you can't help. But to the extent that you're rolling out and you have a rollout machine, and why is that machine not working the way you thought it would or the way you thought it would scale? That's probably the area that investors are sort of zoning in on. It's a huge problem for these companies, because unless you're able to create that scale, you're not going to be very interesting to anyone else.
I think also on that, the investors are obviously money people, and they've signed up to certain returns, and the people that provide the investors with the money, they also have to report back up the chain and say this company that we put your money in as a fund isn't doing as well as we thought. But they can't run the operations. They can do some heavy duty things like switch out the CEO, switch out the COO. But probably the most sensible thing to do now is to look at the financial models again, the 3-year plans, and go, okay, fine. If we switch out 10 CEOs, the market's fundamentally different, and those numbers probably aren't achievable. So what does good look like now? And I think that has to happen as well. And then, but I don't think there's going to be many more entrants into the market. So it is where it is now. But you've got to re-look at the financial models again and work out, what the new, next few years looks like, and whether you still want to invest in that. And that's where the casualties will be, because if the investors don't want to invest, then suddenly that company that's got 250 people or 500 people on its books and 6 or 8 build companies and stock in the yard that's worth whatever, a couple of hundred, £2 or £3 million, they've got to furnish that somehow. So it's going to be interesting.
I'll ask one. Sorry, I'll jump in. You can next, Mr. Callis. Quick one from a customer perspective. So flipping this on the consumer's head, do you think consolidation will be better or worse in terms of price, choice, and service quality? So just welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think from a customer perspective, the whole idea behind having a watchdog in the market is to ensure that there's a lot of competition, because when there's competition, they're driving value and they're driving price that is going to be more customer friendly. So when you have 2 players in the market, that leaves customer with a lot less choice. So when with consolidation and also depending on the role of Ofcom here, with Equinox 2 going down almost a similar path as Equinox 1 shows market a kind of perception that Ofcom has, and that shows signal to the other players as well in terms of how they're going to react. With fewer players, that's not a very good market from a consumer perspective, and I think that's something that Ofcom has got to consider while they navigate the level of competition in this market, and how to keep that competition with probably a 3rd or a 4th fiber operator, have that competition trickle out to the retail level as well. Without that, it's like a monopoly. Then you have sort of a duopoly in this case. You have control over.
What do you think the sweet spot is from loads to 2? What do you think that magic number is in between?
That's so hard to say.
I think what I've seen in some of the areas we've built, we've got 4 or 5 companies in the area, so that's just confusing for any retail customer. And we've had customers that we phoned up, following up on needs, and they go, well, actually, I've just found something from X fibre provider. They're coming to the area in 3 months, or and they're offering cheaper packages. We'll wait for that. So I think that I think a couple plus the big players is fine. I think 6 fibre builders all going after the same customers is madness. So I think there's a sweet spot. I think, it's good to have the choice. It's good to, it does what it's always does, which obviously adjusts prices and discounts, but it also improves customer service. You've got to go the extra mile to keep that customer now for more than 18 months or 2 years, because there is too much choice. And, so that's why you do things to make sure that they love the service, and, you're very reactive.
Yeah, just to add to that, there are also 2 ways of looking at that. You've got infrastructure competition and retail competition. And if you look at different European markets, they follow different models where you have fragmentation on one side, but not so much on the other. So I think on the infrastructure side, it doesn't make sense to have multiple fiber operators laying down fiber on the same ground. That doesn't make sense. There has to be some more, sort of optimization there. On the retail side, it's already a very fragmented market, but the national players still have about 87% of the market share. So the prices are only going to be driven by the infrastructure level competition and value that is added on top of that through the layer of retail.
Graham, do you believe is a government failure after we have one electricity, one gas supply, one franchise, you used to have cable franchises, only in specific areas. Do you believe the government failed to allow so many different companies to provide fiber? Because that seems to be a big problem. You go to an area and you get fiber provided by 3 or 4 companies, and then you go to another area, you got nothing.
So I don't think you can say it's a government failure because they don't have any necessarily control over the number of providers that may step into the market. I think the subsidy model has become very confusing. So what can they do? They can't, anyone can apply for a license to become a telecoms operator in the UK. It takes about 6 months. You have to fill out quite a lot of forms to get your license to be a national operator. And there are many hundreds of telecoms companies, some that just service the business market, some that are a reseller of, on Openreach's network and provide national connectivity or telecom services plus IT support, for companies. So the problem we've got now, and it's something that's very real and happening at the moment, is that the build of networks is so rapid that the grant system that we're going through at the moment isn't able to keep up with the amount of build. So the government, let's just say, choose an area, Derbyshire releases a tender and says that we want all of these areas that haven't been built in Derbyshire built, and we're going to put the following money up, and you respond to that, you say how you're going to build it, how you're going to wholesale it, and they've got a pot set aside for subsidy. That takes 6 months. So by the time that has been adjudicated and then someone's been awarded that grant pot, it doesn't stop others building already there. And then once you've built that, you can't then subsidise overbuild. So the way the subsidy model is working at the moment isn't keeping up with the speed of the build that's going on by Virgin, by Openreach, and by these 150 alt providers. And it's getting very confusing. What used to work well was just you've built an area that was complicated, and we allocated a grant pot for that area. And it used to be in smaller lots, a couple of thousand homes, and you'd get a gigabit voucher. The gigabit voucher scheme is still running in parallel with these new lots that are coming out as well. So it's all getting very confusing. And consultants are making a huge amount of money helping alt providers and the bigger players respond to these bids that are very difficult. So I don't think anything particularly has been done wrong. You can't... I think the subsidy programme that's driven it probably hasn't been the best, but then DCMS didn't expect to happen what happened anyway. So
there could be a little bit more structure like there was in France and Poland, where the government had a much better approach to how they're going to allocate subsidies, how areas are going to be sort of tiered into different regions so that there's construction that is happening across all of these regions at the same time by different operators, and everyone has access to the services at relatively the same speeds, which I think was the key concern here.
I'll give you an example of something that I think went wrong. So just on that point, and it not being aligned properly. We were building areas, okay, and so we'd finished building these areas, we'd marketed to them, we'd let residents know that we were coming in, and you can't take orders until you've finished building based on the way the grant process works, but the second you finish building, some of those areas would immediately be suspended from paying grants because they were now in a pot that was being analysed by the new procurements, and other companies were able to bid on. So you've now built, you have visibility in an area of these villages that are 2,000 or 3,000, properties, and you now can't connect them. So you're getting customers phoning you up, or potential customers phoning you up constantly. You're going, we can't connect you at the moment. We can't really explain what the hold-up is. It's embarrassing. But the network's built. I know that there's a node outside your house that could connect you, instantly, but we can't do anything for 6 months until the adjudication process releases that area to claim the gigabit grants, if no one has said that they plan to build that area in the next 2 years, kind of thing. So it's become very chaotic, and it's impacted the consumer, and that was the whole idea of, that's counter to what the idea of doing all this was. Those rural areas have waited for the build, and now they've got it. And so what do? They then say, well, I can't wait any longer. I've got to renew my Openreach contract. Because you can't give me a date when you're going to be in there. So you then build the network and lose customers because they've gone back to, not Openreach. I've got to renew my Sky contract or my TalkTalk contract for another 18 months. So I can't come with you. And then that screws up the alt provider.
Question.
Excuse me. Matt Fletcher from Technetics. A quick question. I may have missed the figures on some of the slides. What sort of penetration rates are the altnets achieving in terms of subscriber take-up on the homes passed?
So I believe the overall penetration is around 12%, but that's the denominator there might be all homes passed, whether irrespective of technology. If you just filter that by fiber, that could be about 24%, 22 to 24%.
Thank you. And does that, presumably that goes down significantly where you've got 4 or 5 people competing?
Yeah, definitely. So when you have 4 fiber operators, at a retail level, you still have Virgin Media, you still have OpenReach with Sky, and TalkTalk. So at a retail level, even if you have about 7, 8 different players, so you're taking that 100% of market share, cutting it down to 12% each, if that's equal. And that's not, because typically you have Virgin Media with about 30% market share, you've got OpenReach with about 20.
Homes passed, customers signing up, 22, 24% was what the original figure was we're trying to work to. We managed to get 45% on the Isle of Wight. A point made in one of the slides about Trustpilot and being a good service. Now, as these altnets get swallowed up into the next layer and perhaps they don't give the good service, because we all know the bigger the company, unfortunately, the service still struggle. My wife always used to say, never call Sky or never call BT. It was the worst thing she'd ever do. She would try and find somebody local. If these small altnets get swallowed and become bigger and bigger, how are we going to keep maintaining customer service, Trustpilot scores, all this kind of thing, when they're no longer a local company? And will that drive down customers, or customers just have to go, well, this is the only company we can go with, we'll just have to go with it? What's people's thoughts on that?
So I can answer that in part. I think that it is incredibly important to provide customer excellence. And I think it is what the alt providers see. It's not just about building a brand, but you've got to go that extra mile to make sure that you do everything you can to make them love the fibre that you've given them, and the fact that you can react really quickly, be out within half a day to sort out any individual fibre breaks and get people re-spliced up, and deal with the breaks further back in the network within 24 hours. That's got to happen, and that's got to continue. So I think that even through consolidation, it's absolutely got to be one of the drivers if the fibre providers want to survive. If you were to take all of the fibre providers and just free that one network up to being a wholesale network with fewer brands, would that be a better way to go? So that you've got access to many millions of homes at a wholesale level, but actually only a few of those brands. At the moment, the alt space is there are very few wholesale providers and a huge amount of local brands just trying to build up their customer base and prove that they're a credible company and aren't going to go bankrupt in the next 6-12 months. So how is it going to happen? It's an absolute necessity. It's the one thing that they can continue to do well as consolidation happens. If you take your eye off the ball, then you'll just open up again to losing customers to the bigger players again, who've got quad play services, etc. So you've got to have something that you champion and do well. Fiber's an enabler. It doesn't stop you having all those other services, Netflix and Now TV and things like that over it. It's an enabler to a home entertainment in essence. So you've got to do all of that right.
But it's a service you find more important than a broken arm nowadays. You'd rather have your broadband working than anything.
Yeah.
With a caveat though, I think it's also switching costs. So how easily is it for you to switch providers from one to the other? I think the government is trying to come up with that one switch system where you can very, very quickly swap over, much like you do with utility company, with your gas provider. If that barrier is reduced, then the switching cost reduces significantly, and that can ease a lot more. There's a lot more churn with that. Currently in the market, with tie-ins with your bundles and your, cutting off your supplier and then waiting 14 days to get internet in your home, that's just not a model where consumers will risk losing out this service at the cost of taking something else.
It's a good point. One-touch switching it has to be rolled out by everyone. So, yeah, you will lose customers pretty quickly if you don't provide, good customer service. Good point.
I have a follow-up to that, actually, just interestingly. So we talk about consolidation, and there's probably two folds because different approaches. There's the infrastructure consolidation, and then the commercial element, the sales, the service type, the front brand that people buy off. Do you think one or the other has a bigger challenge, first of all? So probably a two-part question. Is it harder to consolidate infrastructure than it is the commercial? And then the second part to that is, once we do have a consolidated infrastructure, do you see new commercial-only entries to the market, big brands that fancy going into broadband provision?
Yeah, I think an interesting approach for this market would be for a vertically integrated altnet. So an altnet that has their fiber layer, but also has a customer presence, for them to disaggregate this model so that they have, sort of spin off with one retail presence and the infrastructure. That infrastructure can get aggregated towards, infrastructure-oriented companies, Virgin Media, City Fiber, whatnot. But the infrastructure, there'll be likes of Vodafone that is desperately trying to increase their market share, that'd be more interested in that. So this kind of a approach where you're disaggregating, there's much more value in having these two separate than sitting together. That's a really interesting question, and I think there are different approaches that market has to be a little bit more creative in adoption.
I agree, absolutely.
And do you think we'd see new players from a commercial point if we got to that, a single infrastructure, a nice wholesale model? Do you see, completely random people entering the market and challenging the BTs and the Virgin Medias of the world?
That's a very hard thing to do, and I'm not originally British, but what I understand is that there's a lot of, these brands are very well known. They hold very strong equity in the market. And for a new entrant, especially, I think you have a lot of resellers also. So TalkTalk has, I think, about a third. So 30% of their customer base is on a reseller network, which are smaller local ISPs. So this model is already existing in the market. Whether there'll be smaller ISPs, there could be, where altnets have very, very strong consumer-facing brand. Their brand is, sort of very well recognized by those local communities. They could continue to withstand and be a part of the reseller network of the national level ISPs, but have another national ISP, very unlikely.
Just a thought, James. Could be Google, Amazon, Apple coming in on top of these wholesale networks. That could be a
They do provide MVNO services.
Possibility,
so, yeah.
Right? They have a customer brand, they have devices in people's hands.
I think they've done that in a
That's
couple of
already
markets and
happening.
exited.
That's already happening. I mean, Facebook were in on the last round of the Premiership. They're all keen to just acquire, provide the services to the end customer. I mean, the all providers are providing an enabling platform, and at the moment they've got an advantage that they've got a gigabit capable network that they can put into a home. But when it's all wholesaled, will those smaller brands survive? No, because I'm not saying no. I think that there will be some brands that will emerge from the altnet space that'll be big brands, powerful brands that are well known in the country now. But 150 brands aren't going to survive, that's for sure. Because once the network is opened up, Sky, TalkTalk, and all the big players are going to want to access fibre to the home. And they don't mind which network it's through. If they can easily provision a customer, they'll do it through the one that happens to have fibre into that place. That's going to be challenging for those that are trying to build up a brand, without a doubt.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think if you look at the ecosystem of products that are coming out by Apple, by the leading tech players, and if you're looking at VR and that being embedded into homes, maybe you're talking about much later in the line, but that does provide, from a broadband perspective, from a communication perspective, a very strong value proposition to have that inlay into their homes.
I think just on that, then brands you referenced there, that's where my head had wandered to, that their proposition relies on connectivity, and being in a connectivity market, it would be interesting whether they wanted to come in and deliver the full package rather than just services within it. So yeah, they're the brands I was thinking of that are strong outside the telecoms market and then entering all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's a complicated business though, so then getting that right know-how, getting that team set up, whether it's worth putting in that kind of investment, has to have a strong value proposition to consider that at that point.
Any other questions? Final call?
I thought this was going to be before lunch. Everyone's going to be very eager to get up, but really appreciated this discussion. It was
No, that's fine. I think you've escaped nice, that's fine. Obviously lunch, by all means grab them.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you
No,
so much.
Thank you very much.